Okay, here we go. I'm not going to talk too long because for all of you, this should basically be review, especially if you're coming straight out of English 101 and into 102, because English 101 kind of ends with an MLA exam that is basically repeated at the beginning of 102 because nobody's expecting you to have the same professor back to back, because in college that wouldn't happen. But we do have people, like Mr. Gables, for instance, who are not coming directly out of 101. And we've got people out there in TV land who are not coming directly from 101. So we do need to review it a little bit. But for some of you, this is going to feel very repetitive because you just did it like last month. But just the same, this course starts with an MLA review and an MLA test that constitutes 5% of your final grade. So, give me your toughest MLA questions. What's hard for you all? Or is documentation just the easiest thing we do all semester?
It's easier than writing papers.
It's easier to have to come up with content. Okay, rule number 1. Anything you get from another source must be cited. Whether you use a direct quote, and in my experience, the kind of students I get never mess up on direct quotes. If they have quotation marks, they have cited a source one way or another. Where people get into trouble is where they have gotten information from a source, but they didn't quote it directly. And people don't know what they're supposed to do there, and sometimes that's when things get dropped, and that's when you accidentally plagiarize, right? So, whether it's a direct quote, or a paraphrase, or a summary, you have to indicate in the text that it came from somewhere else. Quote, paraphrase, summary.
See, I didn't know paraphrases had to be cited
Aha.
or something.
So see, it's good that we reviewed.
I just thought it was quotes.
No. If it comes from another source, quote, paraphrase, or summary, it has to be cited in the text. Now, does that mean that you always have to have a parenthetical citation? That you always have to have a little thing that looks like this? Why not, Lily?
You can be like, at the beginning of their paper, the author, whatever their name is, stated that, and then you can like incorporate it in your wording.
Yep. Quote, paraphrase, summary. You could say something like, the author, Bart Simpson, claims whatever. Now, if there is a page number, you're almost never going to put the page number in the actual text. So you'd still need it. You'd still need that little 36. But if you're using a source that doesn't have a page number at all, obviously you can't do that, and you won't have the parenthetical citation at all. And if you have done your works cited page correctly and indicated that you got that online, it will be clear to the reader that there were no page numbers, right? Anything they give you that keeps track of where you are, whether it's page numbers or paragraph numbers, you should read those, use those. And if you had a paragraph number instead of a page number, it would just look like this. PAR 36. But very often online you don't have those. You don't have page numbers or paragraph numbers. But when you have them, you should use them. Okay, good. Now, it goes without saying you don't have to, or at least it probably doesn't because I say it about 6 times a semester. You do not need to learn the works cited entries. You will always get those models from some kind of handbook. You can do it online. Purdue OWL is especially good if you wanna use online. Your textbook right now has got models for MLA citation in it and APA citation, which is what we'll be doing the second half of the semester. But you don't have to memorize that stuff. People come to me all the time and say they're completely lost because they don't know how to do an MLA citation and they're not modeling on anything. I think they're supposed to learn that, memorize it. It's not volume of a cone. We'll go back to the formula every single time for different sources. Okay, so that's nothing to get scared about. Now, a couple of notes about plagiarism. Which people tend to really think is either I quoted something and didn't cite it, I copied the whole thing off the internet, or I copied the whole thing from my friend. The last two of those we don't even classify as plagiarism, we pretty much just call it cheating. But the first one is a form of plagiarism, but so is something called patch writing. Which is when your whole paper is stuff you got from other places. Or it's when you basically are directly quoting somebody and just using synonyms, and you think that constitutes a paraphrase, because it does not. A paraphrase has to be in your own words, even if it's roughly the same length. I think paraphrases are the trickiest, they're the hardest to get right. Most of the time, if you don't need to shorten it in any way, you might as well quote it, to be safe. Because I think paraphrase is tough. If you're gonna make essentially the exact same length of sentence, the temptation is always gonna be to just replace it with synonyms and plug it in there. And that is a form of plagiarism. It's called a paraphrase too close to the original, or patch writing. Or to obviously to not cite is a form of plagiarism, even if it's unintentional. Anything in that school that anybody has any questions about before we move on? Anything you have been marked down on that you're like, I didn't know I was doing that wrong. Now is the time to get your questions answered, because this will be your last MLA lecture of the semester, of high school for that matter.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So if I got a piece of evidence from a source that got it from another source, do I need to cite both sources or just the one I got it from?
Just the one you got it from. But if you are, your best bet, if that original source has some credibility that you'd like to use. Let's say you read in Bill Nye's book his sort of paraphrase of Einstein's theory. You want to refer back to Einstein because he has the most credibility. So in your model that you mentioned earlier, you would put his name in the text, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, but you didn't get it directly from Einstein. So what goes at the end of that is a fancy little thing that looks like that. The QTD is quoted in 947. And this is in your new textbook, they kind of walk you through these odd cases. They also walk you through how to use the ellipsis and stuff like that, where you need to make changes in the brackets. You need to make changes, so make sure you review that before your test. But they do a really good job of handling these sort of odd cases. A lot of handbooks just kind of blow off. But then what goes on your works cited page will be this. Because that's where you got it from. In some elaborate cases, I mean, once you get up maybe in graduate school, it might be worth it to go back to that original source because there might be other stuff in there. I mean, like that's a research technique, but I don't think you need to worry about it right now. But when you get up in your 400 level classes and in grad school, you're gonna have professors who say, why didn't you go back to this original source? That's obviously what you really wanted to see. They're gonna tell you to do it, but no, at this stage, that's the way we handle that. Now, let's look at, we'll get the complicated one off there for now. One other thing I want to hit in this review. What is this?
Last name.
Uh-huh. And why do we put the author's last name there? What do you put there if you don't have an author's last name?
The title name?
Here's what you need to remember. We will shorthand this every time, and I do it too, as author's last name, page number, author's last name, page number. But this really is the first word of your works cited entry. And if you think of it that way, you're not gonna end up with a source that you don't have an author for at midnight the night before your paper's due going, well, so what do I put in there? Think of it, always think of this as the first word of your works cited entry. Or if the first word is something repeated over and over again, like sometimes you'll have American, especially in health papers, the American Cancer Society, the American Lung Association, that, you know, then the first couple of words. But that's why you alphabetize your works cited page in MLA. You alphabetize your works cited page so that your reader can go from here to your works cited page and find exactly the source that they want to refer back to. Now, you'll find that APA does it differently, and APA cares about different things. But in MLA, this is always the first word of your works cited entry. And it seems silly when you've got 4 sources, but you will write papers where you have 28, believe it or not. Not in my class, but somebody will let you do it someday. And in that case, that suddenly becomes important. Okay. One more thing we need to talk about. What are we talking about when we say you need to integrate your sources? If you look at the grading criteria, that is actually part of a couple of different criteria on the rubrics. How well you integrate your sources.
Well, integrate means like move in, so like blend almost.
There you go. Blend is actually a good word, Jacob. When you're writing a research paper, which we will do this semester, when you're writing a true research paper, and I'm standing up here telling you that you have to cite everything that comes from another source, you are likely thinking, well, in a research paper, isn't that just going to be citation, 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 citation? But it's not. Because anytime you use another source, you need to explain the purpose of that source. And if you had me last semester, or the semester before that, you heard me talk about quote sandwiches or quote windows. Integration has to do with this source sandwich model. Anytime you use material from another source, you will introduce that source, often you're going to want to use the author's name. That's the model that Lily was talking about a minute ago, but you don't necessarily have to. But you need to tell your reader, there's evidence coming up. You're going to introduce the source. You're going to include the evidence, whether it's a quote or a paraphrase or a summary. And then you're going to explain its relevance to your argument. What is it doing there? What do you intend for us to get out of it? I know if you have been working with material for even just a couple of weeks, it seems obvious to you how good that source material is and what we should get out of it, but I assure you it is not. Explaining its relevance to your argument is essential. This is what we're talking about when we talk about integration. Okay. Y'all tell me, anything hard that I haven't hit upon? Okay. You should have already read chapter 2 and chapter 4, if you had your textbook last week. If not, and you like me were kind of in the haze of being offline for a big part of the week and stuff like that, I'm gonna give you a chance the next couple of days to read chapter 2, chapter 4, and review whatever MLA handbook you use. The one in the textbook is really good, but Purdue Owl is also really good. If you kept or wanna keep your one-on-one textbook, it's got good MLA pages. I will leave that up to you. And for those of you out in TV land, also to review this lecture. And then we will have our MLA test this week. Any questions? Lily, you turn us off.